Good evening, everybody, and welcome to episode 26 of Radio Europa. Tonight, I'm joined by Laura from England and Darth from Scotland. Hi, guys.
All right, mate, how you doing?
Tonight, we're going to discuss the Aachen Treaty, which has received quite a low amount of press coverage in recent days, and Act 10 of the Yellow Vest movement in France. So, the Aachen Treaty is quite a big thing in terms of European integration, and it's snuck below the surface, really, because there's been other issues in the media, and it's as if I think it's been quite convenient because the media outlets are aware that it's an unpopular treaty. So Laura, I know you've done a bit of reading into this today. Do you want to just give us an overview of what's going on with the Aachen Treaty, what that's all about?
Yeah, sure. So basically today, German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron have met and signed a treaty, which is supposed to deepen their alliance. So the title of the treaty is the Treaty of Franco-German Cooperation and Integration. And it basically just pledges stronger political, economic and defence ties and restates their commitment to the European Union. So it's supposed to have been signed at a time of crisis for the European Union. And they just basically want to deepen their ties and their connections as Britain sets to leave the European Union, if that does actually happen. Out of those three things that I just said, political, economic and defence, it's defence that's kind of triggering everyone and making people worry, because obviously there have been talks of a European army for quite a while now. And Guy Verhofstadt, who's obviously the European Parliament's representative in the Brexit negotiations, gave a speech where he promoted the idea of the EU army. He said that we need to protect ourselves against Russia if necessary. Emmanuel Macron also supports the idea of a European army. He said that having 28 different armies, which obviously represent the 28 member states, is a waste of money and it's a danger for our collective security. And Merkel also supports the idea of an EU army now. So it's just kind of getting more and more like some kind of duplication of the Soviet Union or something. They're just centralising power more and more and taking away nations' rights to sovereignty. So, I mean, one thing that I find really interesting about it is that we've got people like Guy Verhofstadt and Merkel and Macron, and they're teaming up and they're trying to, form this European alliance. But then on the right, we've also got a populist alliance. So we've got people like Salvini and Viktor Orban, Janice Atkinson in Britain, Marine Le Pen, and also Bannon as well has been speaking with them. And they're like on the opposite side of the boxing ring and they're starting this populist movement. So it is like two teams that are kind of coming up against each other now. So it's definitely one to keep an eye on. I think we're about to go through quite a period of change in the next few years.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, from the words in this treaty, it seems like the liberal part of the European spectrum is very much doubling down on their plans to hasten integration. But I mean, it's all quite vague, and that to me that's ominous, because they leave it open to interpretation. But we kind of get a picture here. So they use phrases like common military culture, providing aid and assistance. Deepen cooperation, all these things, which basically we know what it all means, European army and things like that. What I found interesting, I don't know if you looked into this too much, but what I found very curious was the creation of Eurozones, or cross-border counties, if you like, where they're looking to sort of share local services and promote bilingualism. I mean, what do you think the aim is here? Because are they trying to merge the two countries, or are they trying to make Germany France or France Germany, or what the hell's going on culturally here?
Well, what struck me, I'm just was reading an article there, and there's a quote. This is in the Financial Times. Right at the end of the article, Mr. Macron addressed those critics in his speech in Aachen. Those who don't learn the lessons of our reconciliation are accomplices in the crimes of the past. So it's a little bit vague, but at the same time, it's quite kind of alarming to basically say, well, either get with us or you are criminals and you're going to be condemned for everything that you stand for.
So he's basically saying, if you don't stand with us, you're a Nazi.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
I mean, to kind of go to your question, I mean, like you're saying, it's services, it's, you know, rails, road networks, even probably digital sharing of information. So, I mean, that to me says, you know, I mean, if countries are sharing digital information, you're pretty much on the way there to amalgamating into one country. Now, the cynic in me, it says France and Germany both failed to conquer Europe in times gone past, so why don't they just try together?
Well, it's quite a plausible idea because, I mean, we know that the end game of the European Union is total integration into a single state. So obviously that can only happen if it's led by one of the major players. So I'm sure that it is their aim.
And the Pope has recently been quoted as saying that he thinks that both America and Europe need to be, you know, governed under one world government. So, you know, that's the head of the Catholic Church is pushing for that. Well,
this is what I was going to get onto next, and I was going to ask Laura about this. Do you, because the impression I get is they're trying to reconceive the notion of nationhood, and actually, I get the impression that people like Macron and Merkel, they see the nation state as a sort of outdated 19th century model of governance, and they're trying to reconceive governance and make it more global and more continental or whatever. I mean, do you get the impression that that is implicit in this treaty, that the nation state is obsolete?
Well, yeah, I mean, like you said, it's just that kind of softy kind of language, isn't it, where it doesn't really say clearly what they plan to do. It's just like integration and cooperation and all that stuff. But I mean, people call Angela Merkel the de facto leader of the EU. So although obviously that's not her official title, she does seem to have a level of power above everybody else. And Emmanuel Macron is like her pet. So, I mean, if you look at them and then you look at the power that they have in the European Union and compare that to Orban or Theresa May in Britain, they have so much more of a say. And obviously it's because they're like the little puppets of the EU masters and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. But I mean, how many times have we heard like German ministers and French ministers say that there's no such thing as German culture, or the French people don't exist, you know, things like that. They like literally do not appreciate the different ethnicities of Europe and the different cultures. And I think it's becoming more apparent day on day that they just want to merge us into some huge European blob. And when I say European, I don't just mean ethnic Europeans. I mean anybody who's in Europe with a passport. I mean, it's what Kalergi spoke about, isn't it? They just want to kind of mingle everybody up together, and they definitely don't appreciate like the sovereignty of nations and our right to self-determine what we want. Definitely not.
I mean, it strikes to me that it's, you know, part of it is they're just absolutely terrified of any potential repeat of past, you know, with 2 world wars in the last century. So how can we stop that from ever happening again? I know we'll just merge every single European country and that will stop any further outbreak of a world war. But I mean, if you look at you know, 1984, the novel by Orwell, you know, it seems to be that, you know, governments and the left especially almost seem to be using it as an instruction manual right now for everything that they're doing. And obviously in that you've got 3 different kind of the world is split up into like 3 different kind of groups of countries, and that's basically what seems to be happening right now. And you know, then it'll eventually, their goal is a one world government instead of, you know, 3 different groups.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely sounding very sinister, all of these treaties, especially the way they're worded. Before we carry on, I just want to give a shout out to a YouTuber by the username of Das Pooch, who left us a donation a couple of weeks ago, and we didn't give a shout out. We're going to now. He said, "Keep up the great work. Here's hoping for bigger things for DE in 2019. Thank you, Das Pooch." Going back to the issue at hand, I think. Laura, you mentioned about how Merkel's the de facto leader of Europe. I mean, what do you think will happen in cases like this when she goes? Because she is going soon. Her successor has basically been announced. And the leadership of Europe seems to change hands depending on who's got the biggest democratic mandate in their home country. So, for instance, when Tony Blair won massive landslide in '97, for the next few years and in the early 2000s, he was the de facto first minister of Europe. Of course, that passed on to Merkel after he left, and she's the new strong man or strong woman, strong Frau, if you like. of Europe. So when she goes, and obviously Macron is on a bit of a sticky wicket in his home country, I mean, can you see a bit of chaos, a power vacuum, or do you think Germany will just bring forth the next Iron Fist?
Well, I'm actually not sure. I guess it depends on who takes over in Germany. I mean, one thing to mention is that Macron's approval rating is just getting worse and worse and worse. And I've just looked at the last poll, which was taken 2 days ago, and 72% of people disapprove of him, 25% of people approve, and 1% have no opinion. So that's, I mean, 1 year ago, he was at 50% approve, 45% disapprove. So it's just getting worse and worse and worse as the days go on. So, I mean, I personally see him as quite a powerful figure in Europe, but obviously the people of France don't at the moment. So I mean, we don't know what goes on behind closed doors, do we? We don't know how they deal with things. But I know for a fact that they won't give somebody like Viktor Orban the amount of power that Angela Merkel's got. So it will probably be passed over to some other globalist puppet. But it is the European elections as well, isn't it? So that's one to keep an eye on.
Well, that'll be curious, especially in France and Germany, because it will be the first opportunity for citizens in those countries to voice their objections or support, if you like, for the Aachen Treaty. And I'm sure that'll be a big part of the campaigns of parties like the National Rally in France and Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. I'm just sort of thinking outside the box with this Aachen Treaty, though. So I was reading in Deutsche Welle about basically standardizing certain aspects of services and business as well in the private sector. Do you think this is something, and this is just me maybe clutching at straws here, but do you think this is something that big business particularly wants, because it further harmonizes standards and regulations across the two countries and makes it easier to shift goods and workers and whatever if there is no national boundary between them?
Well, as we all know, the markets and businesses hate uncertainty. So if they know that, two countries are, harmonized in almost every sense except in name, or sorry, they're together in all senses except in name, then businesses are going to be much more likely to invest and to trade in those countries, because there's less likelihood of there to be any kind of political fallout or sanctions placed in either country.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself then. Yeah, that's definitely true. So I do think there was a business interest there. But it would be interesting to see if something major politically happened in France, for instance, if the National Rally ever won a presidential election in 2020 or parliamentary elections. It'd be interesting to see whether people take second thoughts on this and wonder, actually, maybe Germany, I'm thinking of the German leaders, they might look to this and say, well, maybe we should get closer to liberal Scandinavia or something. I don't know. It's it would definitely be interesting to see how it goes when the political landscape changes in the next few years. A part of this, which nicely links on to the next topic we're going to speak to, but we're still focusing on Aachen, is that in Aachen, where the treaty was signed today, there was a Yellow Vest protest. It was a German edition of the Yellow Vests. Not a massive protest, but big enough for some mainstream media outlets to ask them about it. Do you guys think that the Yellow Vests are going to now make the Aachen Treaty part of their campaign in France and the wider continent? Because obviously it will be unpopular to them.
Well, there was a Yellow Vest protest in Germany as well today, wasn't there? Have I got that right, William?
Yeah, well, there was one in Aachen, which is in Germany, so yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the Yellow Vest protesters, obviously, which we're going to get onto in a moment, and Darth has some more information on that. Obviously, that it's not just about fuel tax and stuff, is it? And I know they're talking a lot about expenditure for the working class, but it is a fight against globalism, if you go out and listen to what they're saying. So, I just to answer your question very simply, I wouldn't be surprised if they did, if this did become part of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something to watch, because after all, the yellow vest, like you said, it's not really about fuel tax anymore. We're talking about sovereignty, about self-determination. I guess there is a class element as well. There's very much a red element to this, that that it is little people versus, the establishment, David versus Goliath. So, and of course, the big people trotting off to sign treaties that nobody wants is very much a symbol of the gulf between the two groups.
It's the same with the UN Migration Pact as well, isn't it? Because everyone just decided that they wanted to sign that, and I mean, never mind that we weren't asked about it. We were never even really told that it was going to happen. So I do think that the population of the different nations of Europe are just getting sick of leaders going and doing things without confronting us, especially when it's something such as, I mean, the UN Migration Pact spoke about immigration as being a human right. I mean, that's such a dangerous thing. And for people to just go off and sign that without confronting us, I think people are getting extremely pissed off about stuff like that.
And not only is it a human right, this thing plans to make it illegal to criticise migration.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think people forget these things. The leaders of Europe, the de facto leaders of Europe, are using up political capital very, very swiftly on these issues, and people won't just sit back and let it continue for too long. I mean, we can see that the revolutionary spirit in France is awakening, and hopefully the Germans won't be too far behind, but we'll see. So I'm going to put you on the spot here, and sort of, this is a bit of a strange question, but obviously Merkel is a lame duck chancellor, if you like, because she's announced that she's going. Macron is deeply unpopular at home. Do you think that these guys are just basically saying, well, fuck it, they hate us anyway, we might as well just do what we want and wreck everything? Do you think there's an element of that in their mindsets?
Well, I mean, we know that almost all the time politicians don't think in the long term. They're thinking of what benefits them in the short term. So obviously Macron and Merkel, are going to benefit out of this. Benefit out of this treaty somehow. I don't know what it is specifically, but they must be benefiting out of it somehow. Elsewise, they wouldn't be doing it. Like personally benefiting, not just as the country.
Yeah, I mean, it does raise the question: what are they getting out of it that we don't know about? Because on the surface, it seems relatively banal, and maybe there's some sinister language in there. But it would be interesting to see how things play out. Whether there's, they use it. I mean, it could be something to dilute the voter pool. So if they merge their political systems, then they'll be less likely to have a vote for an extreme, in quote unquote, candidate, because there's simply more liberals. But we'll see. I don't know. Somebody in the chat's asked what we think about the protests in Athens. I mean, personally, I saw some headlines about this, where the media were screeching about, Golden Dawn are attacking journalists. They weren't, of course, but the media was saying that. Did either of you guys happen to, I mean, it doesn't matter if you didn't, but did you happen to see anything about the protests in Athens?
I didn't, unfortunately. It didn't really come up in any of my timelines.
I think this is about the name change, is that right? Yeah,
it's about the Macedonia thing, because obviously there's a part of Greece called Macedonia, and then there's a country called Macedonia, so if there's a bit of tension there.
Yeah, I think, I'm just reading something out, and it just says many Greeks fear territorial claims on the Greek province of Macedonia would be put in jeopardy because of the change. So that I'm afraid I don't know anything about it, but somebody did actually email us at Defend Europa and ask us to write an article about it, because I don't think the media are covering it fairly, as they usually don't. So it's a story to watch out for. We'll try to get some more information on it.
Yeah, we'll look into that, and if we do find enough material, then we'll definitely publish something. I mean, with all the negative press, it looks like Golden Dawn could do with a bit of support. So we'll see if we can get to the bottom of that issue. Somebody at Sigurd in the chat, I thought it was always protests in Athens. Well, so did I actually. But I've read a book by Yanis Varoufakis about the financial turmoil in in Greece, a few years ago, and it just seems that basically they have puppet government, and they just get dictated to by Brussels and the German banks. So the protests don't reach the ears of the people they need to reach, unfortunately. They need to go to Berlin and storm bloody Deutsche Bank in Minecraft. But anyway, I think we've exhausted the Aachen Treaty for all it's worth. It would be definitely worth keeping an eye on this in future, and if anybody finds any more juicy material out about this, then please send it our way and we will look into it and write about it. So the second part of the podcast, we want to talk about the Yellow Vest movement, because last Saturday was Act 10. Well, normally protests fizzle out by now, but I think these guys have proved they're serious by keeping it going for 10 weeks. And Darth, you've been looking into this. So what's going on with France at the moment then?
So it's surprising and not surprising at the same time that this is, like you're saying, 10 weeks, so the 22nd of November. So we're into our third month of protesting now. And as you said, there's no signs of any stopping. The two things that have jumped out at me, and they did, they were covered last week, but we never had a podcast, so I think it's worth talking about. The French police have been seen carrying semi-automatic rifles now out on the streets. I believe they are I'm trying to find the article that you sent me earlier on. Yeah, Heckle and Koch G36 weapons were seen at the Arc de Triomphe on Saturday afternoon. Now, this article was from the 13th of January. So the police are carrying now semi-automatic rifles, which severely ups the ante, both metaphorically and physically. These protesters are going to be seeing the police carrying rifles and are going to take that in their stride. And unfortunately, it would seem that the police have already used them, as there was a report of a male, it was a firefighter, volunteer firefighter by the name of, I'm going to absolutely butcher this surname, but it's Oliver Biziadi, father of three. He is in a coma after being shot in the head in Bordeaux. This took place on the ninth week, and his wife said the police shot at them like rabbits as an inquiry is open. So the guy's basically been shot in the back of the head. He's a volunteer firefighter, so he's a public servant who other public servants have shot in the back of the head, and he's now been kept in a medically induced coma, and we don't know when he's going to get better. Thankfully, he's not died, but that's potentially a life-changing injury. He could never walk again. He may lose his memory. So people are getting shot in the streets of France, and it's going to do nothing for the positivity or any kind of sign of recovery for Macron and his government. And there was another video which surfaced in the last day or two, protesters again, and somebody is pulling a protester away, and a police officer is walking by. As he's walking by, he's seen to swing his baton across the back of this protester's head, who proceeds to collapse on the ground unconscious. No need for it, completely uncalled for. The protester wasn't doing anything aggressive, and he or she has been knocked out cold simply for being there. There was a little bit of hope that the police were kind of backing what was going on, but it seems to be that a lot of them are just, I can imagine they've had enough of this as well. I mean, they'll be working overtime all the time, working for 10 weeks straight, probably 12, 16-hour shifts. So they're not going to be seeing their family. So in a way, I can see it from their side. They're going to be absolutely fed up with this, not being able to see their family. So they're going to take their frustrations out somewhere. And unfortunately, it's happening to the French people. So it's not looking good right now.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some pretty disturbing pictures, like the ones we've put on screen and like the ones you've mentioned there, Darth. There was one case, I think last Saturday, a teenage couple beaten senseless by the police. They were just standing outside a shop. I mean, the situation is pretty brutal. And I can see some people in the chat are talking about gun rights, and I think this is one of the problems, is that it's not that the French people don't have guns, it's that the police are using guns on an unarmed population. That should at least be evened out. But there has been some information doing the rounds. Apparently, the French government are trying to confiscate firearms because they fear an armed insurrection. So we'll definitely keep an eye on that and bring you any information that's relevant on Defend Europa in the coming week. Just want to say welcome to Boris from Croatia. He's joined us finally, better late than never. So hi, Boris, how you doing?
Hello. Sorry for being late. And hello, guys. Hashtag smirk nationalism.
Hi, Boris.
Yeah, I hope everybody's smirking in the chat, because that is the new symbol of white privilege, and we all need to get a good smirk on.
Guys, smirk on the anti-whites.
Exactly. And Boris, now that you're here, do you want to give us your thoughts on the Yellow Vest, Act 10? And did you see anything interesting over the weekend?
Act 10, right. Citizens in danger. Well, there's an article up on the website about the 10th week of the protests. And basically, a few big things happened. To quickly summarize it, one thing that happened during the whole week was that the French police have now got a new sort of weapon, which people are calling flashball guns. And they're especially made for riot suppression. And the controversy is that these flashball guns are extremely dangerous, especially if aimed at people's heads. There was the case of that French firefighter. He was shot in the back of the head. Olivier was his name. And he ended up in a coma. And thankfully, last Friday, he came out of that coma. But there are some gruesome images going around, and these weapons are very, very dangerous. So that was one thing that happened. Another thing was Macron's national debate, which he did that on Tuesday with the intent of stopping the riots, but it hasn't worked out so far. And he did say that he's sticking to his reforms, his economic reforms. So it's looking very shabby for him.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely looking bad for Macron. As well as those things, did anybody see the images of the protesters attacking I think it was the office of the central bank or a Rothschild bank or something? But did anybody have any more detail about that?
Yeah. They were the protesters were apparently trying to do a bank run, but it was a sort of start and stop motion that happened there at the banks. They did attack, I think, two banks. One was that bank that you mentioned, and another one was the French National Bank. But they seem to have stopped with that intention so far. Yeah,
I noticed their bank run when they planned to get everybody to withdraw their money. It didn't really go anywhere, and I heard that there were some things going around in the media that the banks had basically capped withdrawals and were just not letting people take all their money out. So that doesn't surprise me. It's a sort of move they'd make to try and stem the flow, because I think as the more economically savvy in the audience will know, that obviously they operate a fractional reserve system. So even if just Parisians were to withdraw all their money, it would send a chain reaction so big down the banking system that the whole thing the house of cards would collapse. So, they're definitely concerned about that. Any attacks on the banking system, which suggests that's the area we should be protesting in. But it's been interesting to see that the British media, the print media, has been pretty fair in their coverage of this, but the BBC and Sky News, the two foremost television media, have basically been absolutely silent on the Yellow Vest since the first couple of weeks. And as everybody knows, it's been doing the rounds that the British government or the judiciary have slapped a D notice on the issue, so that the media couldn't report certain aspects of it, like civilian casualties. I mean, we know that 10 people have died already during the protest, but you wouldn't know if you read the BBC.
Oh, yes. Just one thing to jump in about those 10 people who died. There were, this time around, that was a big theme of the protests. There were banners which said specifically in French, citizens in danger. I'm sorry, I don't know how to say it in French, but citoyens en danger. I don't know. My French is horrible. So the protesters, they carried banners which were in the shape of coffins, and they were black. and they had crosses and like for every religion, the symbol, and the names of the people who died. It was a sort of commemoration, silent protest that they were trying to do to get tensions to be lowered.
That's interesting, because, like I said, if you just read the mainstream media in the UK, you wouldn't know that there'd been civilian casualties at all. So
I think the only one that, to be fair, I mean, the article that I read about that French policeman being shot, that came from the Daily Mail. So I don't know if there's a complete, blackout from the British media. Just to be fair. But it would seem very much so that the bigger media companies, like you said, the BBC and Sky News, are just simply refusing to cover it unless something absolutely crazy happened. Because there was an article today about a bank robbery that took place in France, and that seemed to make the rounds more than anything else that has happened in France in the last 10 weeks.
Yeah, precisely. And I don't think I think the reason that the British media is not talking about this is that there was a sort of attempt by Britons to emulate the Yellow Vest sort of movement in London a few weeks back, and they are trying not to give the citizenry any ideas. Sorry, Laura, do go on.
Well, it wasn't really a very large point, but I was just going to say, if you only read the BBC and Sky, then you wouldn't know that hundreds of thousands of young English girls had been groomed and raped by Pakistani men. They just choose which information to omit and not bother to tell us. And I remember the weekend that the Telford, I hate the word scandal because it sounds like some housewives gossiping over a fence, but the Telford scandal, where another however many hundred girls were raped, that story was broke. And the BBC just didn't report it at all. But there was a black girl who got shouted at some racist abuse in a university, and they reported that story 3 times. So it's stupid, the stuff that they report. Like clearly they have intentions of keeping specific information from the public. And I think this is one of those examples where they don't want the public to see it, because then we'll start to say, well, what are they protesting against? Should we do that too? And it would have a negative knock-on effect for them, I think.
I think the other thing is with, the protests going on for so long, it shows that there's deep unhappiness in Europe, and obviously the government is doing its absolute best, I think, or at least a lot of the politicians are doing their absolute best to keep Britain in the European Union. And if the mainstream media report more on the problems in France, people are going to say, well, hold on a minute, what on earth are we doing staying in this European Union? I think you would have a lot more people, even kind of who are either on very, very likely on the Remain side or who are undecided, may turn and say, well, no, I don't want this at all, if this is what is happening in France and other European countries.
Yeah, I'm sure there's quite possibly a Remainer motive behind the lack of coverage. Also, I saw some people in the chat asking what a D-notice is. Basically, it's where a judge decides that the media can't report on something, or that there are restrictions around reporting on something.
It's what they did to Tommy Robinson.
Yeah, exactly. It's basically an official word for press censorship. That's all it is. Somebody else has put, who is sovereign? The one with the power to create money out of thin air. This is going back to our fractional reserve banking. That is a very important point. And anybody who's not up to speed with fractional reserve banking and how the banking system works, please educate yourself, because that is the biggest red pill, in my opinion.
Yeah, and just to say, basically, a bank only has to keep 10% of its money as a reserve. The rest it can give out into loans, and people would assume that money is given out, but it's actually, money is just created out of thin air on top of the existing money. It's a terrifying thing to watch, how much money can be created out of a small amount, and that is what is propping up our economy.
Yeah. So
fun fact: about more than 90% of money that quote unquote exists in the world is actually digital. And,
well, in America, it's 3%. In America, the last I heard, 3% of money in America was physical.
Yeah, exactly. And how do we create money? Asking the banks. Well, you see, we create it out of thin air.
Well, exactly. This is how they do it. They just magic money out of thin air, then they charge the government and the people the privilege of using it. That's usury, basically. That's what usury is. So everybody needs to really get clued up on this. Just having a look in the chat. What else have we got? Lying press out. Yeah, well, we agree. Kara also makes the point about Remainers not wanting to see the reality of modern day Europe, which is interesting. On the yellow vest, I mean, there was actually a yellow vest protest today, right by Buckingham Palace, where protesters were holding like some weird vigil for democracy, saying like, "Oh, democracy's dead." So fair enough. Laura, I just come to you on this because it's more of a general question about the yellow vest. Do you think that in the event that Brexit sabotage or some other big political event occurs in the United Kingdom, that the movement could spread to the UK as it is in France?
Yes, I do wonder if it will spread over here once Brexit is betrayed, because I think it's pretty obvious at this point that we're not going to get a clean cut. We're not going to get the type of leave that we wanted from the European Union. So I think people underestimate how so annoyed people are going to be if they screw us over, because it's been building up over the last 2.5 years. It's 2.5 years since we voted to leave. And the people have stayed quiet. We've had a rant on Twitter every now and again, but we've just let them get on with it and not really done anything about it. But when it is betrayed and when we end up staying in or we end up having a second referendum, I do think such a huge percentage of the population will kick off, because the polls are still saying that it's 50-50 leave and Remain. Obviously, you can't trust polls. They said that Remain was going to win by miles. But honestly, every single person that I know that voted leave still wants to vote leave. And I know people that voted Remain that are just disgusted with the way that the government have handled it and the way that the European Union have treated us, and now they want to leave as well. So, yeah, I think that there will be riots and some sort of fight back when we're betrayed, and I do think that we won't leave properly. I think that they're hoping that people are so sick of it now because it's been going on for so long that we're just going to sit down and be quiet about it, but they've completely underestimated us because we won't nowhere.
And just to throw into the mix, just as a kind of wee add-on at the end here, don't know whether you guys have seen much about this, but Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland, has decided that all this means that we're ready for a second referendum on whether Scotland is going to become independent from the UK.
How do you think that would go?
Oh my gosh. So the last referendum in 2014, it was 55 to remain, 45 to leave. 63% of Scotland voted to remain in the European Union. So I have a funny feeling that obviously Brexit will have swung a lot of people to then vote to leave Britain, because one of the mandates that the SNP would do is to rejoin the European Union. The problem is that I think a lot of the rules and regulations for a country to qualify to join the EU, Scotland doesn't actually meet quite a lot of them. So I think it would be very much a toss-up in the air. I was undecided the last referendum, but I certainly would vote to remain this time, because it just seems totally baffling to me that Scotland wants to leave the UK but then join an even bigger conglomerate, especially when the SNP's gone on about wanting to be financially independent and have all control of all of its money from the rest of the UK, and then ultimately hand over its budgets and its control of its finances to Europe.
Well, that's right, because wouldn't Scotland have to join the euro if they joined as an independent country?
Well, there was debate the last time. Salmon said that we would be keeping the pound, but there was never really any proof or evidence to suggest how he would go about doing this. So I think they would ultimately end up needing to either create an entire new currency or join the euro, both which seem to be a terrifying prospect. I would hate the idea of having to start using euros, because ultimately I think their notes are awful looking, although our new banknotes don't look much better, to be honest. But yeah, I really don't know what's going to happen, but it especially when the main draw for Scotland to leave was, there was a lot of oil wealth in Scotland, but the price of oil's dropped out. The market bottomed out right after the referendum. So I don't know what they can run on.
Just to jump in, when countries join the EU, by default they have to adopt the euro and enter the eurozone, unless specifically before they join they have an agreement that they will either adjust or not do one of those two things. But by default, they have to do those two things.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I was just quickly going to say I'd happened to read one of the guys I follow on Twitter had posted something. There was a graph showing kind of all the European countries. I think it was to do with, I don't know if it was to do with GDP or to do with debt, but basically Scotland simply did not qualify within a kind of range of wealth or debt that would allow them to join the EU. So a lot of suggestions would seem to be that Scotland would not qualify to get into the EU in its current financial status. But I really don't know. I'd need to do more research into it.
I mean, it would certainly be an interesting thing if there was another referendum on Scottish independence, because, well, we thrive on, whatever side we're on, we all thrive on a bit of instability because it makes for good talking points. So it would certainly be an interesting prospect. Boris, down in Croatia, what's the mood on what we're doing in Western Europe, the yellow vests and Brexit and all that stuff? What are people saying about that there?
Well, to touch on the yellow vest, there have been small-scale yellow vest, not really protests, more gatherings, you could call them. It was very small scale in the capital and the second city. In the capital was maybe a few hundred people, and the second city was less than 100. But the mood is a little bit different. For example, in Croatia, the situation with the police specifically is that the citizenry supports the police because the police share a lot of the citizens' beliefs and stuff like that. In our country, the situation is that the media often attack the police, especially leftist media, smear the police, saying that they're mistreating migrants along the borders. For us, we have a huge problem with our border all along Dalmatia, the border with Bosnia and Herzegovina, because there are two big sort of points where migrants from the Middle East are trying to enter Croatia and then go past us up towards the northern states because they want welfare. And there are videos and everything, and often the migrants just form into a giant mob and they try to storm the border. And at any one time, there's between 10 and 20 policemen and border guards there. So there have been many scuttles, many migrants getting hurt just because of their actions. And every time that this happens, they record it, and then they find some journalist, quote unquote journalist, who will spread this and use it as an attack on the police, calling them fascists and all sorts of lies. But almost every time the citizens get a wind of it and they ratio those articles on Facebook, on social media. So yeah, that's a snippet of what's happening here.
Yeah, so it sounds like your biggest problem is a really bad press, basically. I mean, we can sympathise, but I think another big story over the last few days has been the guys from that Catholic school in America. I think Laura just wanted to say a few words about that.
Yeah, I just wanted to give him a mention, if that was okay. So Nick Sandman at Covington Catholic High School in America, who everyone's definitely seen the video because it's been everywhere, who stood his ground and just smiled at the American guy who got on his face and started banging his drum and stuff. And when I saw that video, my heart was just overwhelmed with like pride and joy that he stood his ground. And I feel so happy that white people are starting to not take any shit anymore. And we had it with Julian Van Abel, didn't we, a few weeks ago as well, who was talking about white men creating Western civilization. And then there was the Twitter hounding by everyone on him, and he stood his ground as well. And I just think these are good signs. I don't want to be too dramatic and say that times are changing, but hopefully other young lads will look to these lads and see them as an inspiration and will continue to stand their ground as well, because I don't know how old that Nick Sandman was, but he didn't even step backwards to kind of try and compose himself. He stood there so still, stared into his eyes, and he just smiled, and he hasn't apologised. And yeah, I'm just extremely proud of him. I don't know what you guys think.
The interesting thing about that as well is that the truth, you know, people often say, oh, the truth comes out eventually, and in this case it did, because the guy was hounded by the media and all these Jewish journalists saying that they wanted to kill him and whatever. And then eventually the whole of CNN's news team had to apologize, basically. And the media, and even the media in this country, is saying now it's not always what it seems on the surface. And actually Nick did nothing really wrong. He was provoked. So yeah, that was a good episode, I think.
And for my £2 worth, he did release there was a press release. He released a statement which is pretty detailed. I'm going to guess that he had help writing it, but it came from him. He basically said that he really didn't know what the best way to handle it was. So he basically stood there and he said he was smiling because he didn't want to come across as being offensive or trying to start a fight or anything like that. He just figured that was the best way to approach things. But like on what you were saying about CNN, especially in the American media, that's 3 massive stories in a very, very short space of time, whereby, you know, the US mainstream media have completely, you know, made up false stories or taken a story and twisted it into something that it just isn't. And they're being called out for it more and more and more now, and they're having to backtrack. And hopefully this, you know, this is one of these kind of big wake up moments for people to say, no, you can't take what the mainstream media is saying at face value, because there is a clear agenda. And even a lot of leftists were looking at that instant at with this boy and saying, no, this isn't right. This boy literally hasn't done anything wrong, and he's been made out to be a Nazi for smiling.
So just to do a quick recap of it, there was the media came up with edited footage. They used like 10 to 20 seconds of footage to smear a whole class of just Catholic young white boys, and with the attempts to scare basically the minority population of the country, to use it as a huge propaganda tool. And the whole thing was revealed later. The whole footage is actually 2 hours long. And I don't know at this point how anybody in the world can take anything that American mainstream media say at face value. They cannot be trusted.
The media have had to release articles apologising and saying that they got it wrong, which is interesting because that must have really hurt them to do that. But I think
that's because there's going to be I was just going to say there, I'll let you continue, but I was just going to say that's because the families have now got lawyers and they're threatening legal action against the mainstream media. Carry on.
Yeah, well, this is what we should be doing every time. But one of the most disgusting things about this has been the response from leftists and people like Kathy Griffin on Twitter, who have been talking about, I don't know if she said anything that was a call to violence, but I know that she did try to dox them, and she tweeted about it quite religiously for about a full day. But people were talking about murdering them and murdering their families and, you know, all sorts of crazy stuff just because he smiled. I mean, they're completely overplaying their hand and revealing their true colours. So, it is a tool that we can use, really, but it's horrible that white people are having to experience this. But I just hope that we continue to stand our ground.
Standing our ground, smirk nationalism, all.
It's going to be an interesting time over the next few weeks, and I think part of this whole thing the other day was the mainstream media seem to have a kind of anti-Catholic narrative right now, because they went after Mike Pence, the Vice President of the USA's wife, because she took up a job in a Catholic high school, and because it has biblical viewpoints on what they do and don't teach. The left lost their mind because apparently now his wife is anti-gay and transphobic, etc., etc. So this kind of fits into their narrative, and I think there's with the new Supreme Court nomination likely going to be happening soon, because I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg's life is close to being over by the sounds of it. I think that the rumour is that Trump's going to appoint a Catholic replacement, so there's going to be a lot of anti-Catholic movement there, and they'll use these two stories to justify their narrative.
I mean, it's good though in that case that the media has had to backtrack on this. And it's funny, somebody in the chat said, and I think this is a fair point, that Trump called the mainstream media the enemy of the people, and then they started doxing and threatening death to kids. So they kind of prove his point. And it's the same with, you know, when he says globalists, and then all of the tribe come out of the caves and, oh, why are you being anti-Semitic, man? You know. But by the way, Laura, Kathy Griffin, she's not that bitch we used to talk about on the podcast and try and get on, was it? Who is it? Who is that?
Kathy Griffin's the feminist who shaved her head and she held up Trump's head.
The effigy with blood running down its face.
Yeah. She pretended to behead him and held up. And I think she had some sort of nervous breakdown because she used to be quite like feminine with soft skin and, you know, quite well spoken and stuff. And then when Trump got elected, she just, I mean, she's aged about 20 years in 2 years, and she's just relentless. She's just awful, just abusing people, and she's just one of these typical lefties that hates Trump. I don't even know what she is. I think she's an actress or a comedian or something.
Sounds like she's fucking mental, actually. But you know, that's just my opinion for the sake of saving my own asset. I think we're just going to have a look at a few more comments in the chat. There's a few I wanted to look at. So somebody asked, Tenebris Anima asked, do you think there could be a Bolsonaro-style revolution? Yeah, I think it's going to take a bit longer because obviously Le Pen didn't do as well as we'd have liked in France. They've got a bit of a way to go before they look like they're going to win an election, so we'll see. I don't know what you guys think about that. Do you reckon there's a chance for that kind of thing to happen in Europe?
Well, on the Bolsonaro point, there's very interesting news out of Portugal. It happened over the weekend, but it's extended to up till now. There's 2 articles up on the website about it, but it's actually quite similar to what's been going on in Brazil. In Brazil, the problem is a ridiculous crime wave, and the populace literally calling for the army and police to step in. And we've seen that a heck of a lot since 2015 with migrant crime and terrorist attacks. So, and the Yellow Vest now, it's not going to take long before it happens.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see something like that. And I think if it was to happen, it's probably going to be in a Mediterranean country as opposed to in Northern Europe, where we're a bit cooked, I'm afraid. Somebody's asked, did we see the other video of the man in North Carolina defending his wife and child against a gang of teens? They tried to make him out as racist too. I didn't personally see that.
I think I saw. I didn't watch the video, but I think I saw somebody describing something that sounded like that, and people were basically saying, "Look, don't even try and take on the mob because it's not worth your own life." I get it, you know, people are wanting to fight back, you know, when these things happen, but when you've got a group of 10, 20, 30 folk who are just willy-nilly, you know, they're not even looking for people who are wearing MAGA hats now. It's simply just they're walking up to people and saying, you know, what's your view? Are you this? Are you that? Because there was 2 Marines who were attacked for no reason, and they were beaten up. They weren't conservative. They weren't anything. They were just targeted because these liberals have lost their mind and they just want to attack anybody who isn't openly declaring their loyalty for, you know, progressive movement.
Yeah, I mean, the liberal sphere of politics in all our countries really has had a total mental breakdown. These people have gone mad and shown their true colours, which is positive in a way because it totally validates what people like Trump, Bolsonaro and Orban and so on and so forth are saying about them. So, yeah, I mean, okay, we don't really want to see people getting attacked and things like that, but these events do serve to validate what we've been saying all along. So it's definitely something to watch out. So on that note, I think we're going to wrap up in a moment. Before we do, I just want to say that if you'd like to help us out, help us keep doing what we're doing and donate to us, there's links in the description below for you to do so. Also, thanks to everybody, Darth, Boris and Laura, for coming on tonight.
Smirk nationalism, y'all.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, so I think that's all from us. And have a good night, everybody. And remember, keep smirking.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.